Welcome to She Considers a Field podcast with coach, encourager, and fellow entrepreneur and homeschooling mama of four, Anna McLaughlin. As a homeschooling entrepreneur, you are uniquely positioned to impact the kingdom of God both deep through your investment in your children and wide through your business. And yet guilt, frustration, and overwhelm can hold you back from all that God has for you. Come with me on a journey to walk in deeper peace, purpose, and joy, because God has given you a legacy to build, and I'm here to help you enjoy the ride.
It is my honor, friends, to bring back Logan Hufford for our second conversation. If you missed last week, please be sure to listen to it, but just a little bit as a reminder about who Logan is. Logan is a born and raised Alaskan, married to his gorgeous bride, Carrie, who herself is a fourth-generation Alaskan, and together they raise four amazing but crazy little monkeys. Their life is a simple one. They love their family time, their dogs, and exploring the beautiful Alaskan wilderness. And yet absolutely none of this would be possible today. For years, Logan did just about everything in his power to destroy his marriage and his life. Logan was a raging sex addict. Pornography, affairs, hiring prostitutes, and more had simply become a way of life for Logan. He thought he had no hope. In 2016, God began to change all of that. Through recovery, God transformed Logan's life and his marriage. Logan and his wife, Carrie, each now lead recovery groups, doing what they can to give back by sharing the gifts that God has given. Now, as you may have caught in the last interview episode, 2 episodes ago, Logan came on and talked extensively about his journey to recovery. And now, journey in recovery, let me say. And now we are diving into the topic of how to navigate instilling these values of purity and pursuit of what God calls us to, that high holy standard in our children's lives. The conversation took a turn I did not expect. Friends, you're not going to want to miss this. Okay, friends, hello and welcome to another episode of She Considers a Field podcast, part 2 with the wonderful Logan Hufford. Logan, thank you so much for being with us.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
Okay, so in our world, we just finished an hour-plus long conversation digging into all of the kind of the redemption story that Logan and his family have experienced. You guys need to go and check out that episode. It's in the show notes if you haven't caught it. This episode, just to give you a little quick summary, we are actually going to be talking about, we're going a generation back. We're talking about how can we, as parents, especially homeschool parents, Logan homeschools his 4 boys. Of course, you know, most of us listeners and I myself are homeschool families. How can we guide, shepherd, nurture, nourish our children to have a healthy sexual relationship in marriage and to have a healthy relationship to their sexuality and their identity as they're growing up? So that's the conversation we're endeavoring to have. And so as we kick this off, Logan, first of all, I just want to set the table that you and I kind of talked about ahead of time. There are no experts on this phone call.
Right. Yep.
You are listening to no experts. So, but this is a conversation between 2 parents who really care about this topic. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Logan, to just give, everybody can listen to your first episode to hear a little bit more about your story, but give us the rough highlight of just a quick synopsis of your story and kind of how that relates to this desire to have these conversations with your children now.
So until I was 25 years old, or through 25 years old, I was steeped in sexual addiction, pornography, affairs, all of that. I was married for several of those years, had kids. So as a dad, as a husband, living in this place of shame and self-hatred and despair, definitely, knew that okay, I'm not equipped to lead these boys. I am not equipped to be an example because I would only be a hypocrite. There's no legacy of anything other than pain that I'll be leading. So how can I even try to be a good dad? How can I even try to be a good husband? God did incredible transformative work in myself, in my family, my marriage, in Carrie, in healing from sexual betrayal trauma. And as you said, of course, we went really deep into all of that. But we've got 4 boys, and we've got 4 boys that are 12, 11, almost 10 here in a couple days, and 8.
Wow.
And yeah,
They are
not-
so close together. I'm just like, my mind is bending right now.
not a quiet house, not a quiet house.
No, I'm sure.
So yeah, 100% not an expert. Don't have it figured out. Every day is a new exercise in humility, but I don't take for granted what God rescued me from. I don't take for granted what God rescued my family from. And, a primary mission of mine is to reach men and help men that are struggling. And another primary mission is to lead these boys to be men who love God, who love others. And a big part of that is, of course, what we'll talk about today.
Yes.
But yeah, the only platform I am speaking from is a platform of gratitude for what God has done, and an awareness of the fact that while I don't have this figured out, I'm going to do what I can to be intentional. I'm going to lead my boys and love them and teach them as best I can, as of course my wife Carrie is as well.
Well, and that's one of the reasons and I'm so grateful that you're willing to do this, because I think sometimes, especially in this podcasting space, we can shy away from speaking into a place that we haven't lived all the way through, or feel like, okay, I know the bow on this story, right? I see how it's all wrapped up. And yet I think there's what I know from my own life and my own redemption story is that it's in the very areas that I failed, that I sinned, that I fell short, or that I was deeply wounded, where I have become uniquely strong and equipped to turn around and go, it's going to look different now. Like, as for me and my house, here's how it's shifting. And so I thought that it would be a missed opportunity to not hear your perspective on parenting in light of your story, because although you're in the middle, right? Your kids are 12 and under, even though we don't see the finished product yet of like, look at how well-rounded and da 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 da, like that's coming, right? By the grace of God, that's coming. Nonetheless, there's a unique strength in you and Carrie because of what you walked, and a unique discernment to go, okay, we know what it can look like when it's going sideways. And so we're going to be uniquely intentional here. So I so appreciate this conversation for that reason. So, okay, you shared a little bit about your story, your childhood, your teenage years. Talk to me about how, like, and that was in the other episode, but I feel like for this one, it would be helpful to have that in this container too. What do you feel like went amiss in your growing up years, where whether it was something that you needed externally or something that was lacking internally that opened the doors for what became this addiction to pornography and sexual addiction?
Like I did in the previous conversation, I'll give a disclaimer here. This one's gonna be a little bit different, which is, please don't hear any part of my response as anything other than I take ownership of my choices. I take ownership of, like, I got myself trapped in that cave of addiction. I did that. My choices did that. It wasn't my parents. It wasn't my lineage. It wasn't sin. It wasn't porn. I did it. But in response to your question, so I had a really, really healthy, generally speaking, family. Was raised in a Christ-centered home, baby of 5, both parents raised us. And I would say my parents, honestly, they did a phenomenal job raising kids. They didn't pour into their marriage, which is a side thing. They actually, the year I got into recovery, the year our youngest Isaiah was born, my dad left my mom after 35 years, which doesn't technically connect. And yet there's absolutely, there's stuff there that I could look back on and see a lack of some stuff.
Yes.
So they really poured themselves into parenthood in a really, really good way, but not into their marriage. So I was raised in a house of love. I was raised in a house where I felt safe. I knew that I was cared for. I knew that things would be provided for. We weren't rich, we weren't spoiled, but I knew that my family would take care of me, that our needs were taken care of. The one exception. And this isn't like, woe is me. Every family is going to have, something missing. So largely speaking, I had an incredible childhood. But one thing that definitely was missing was vulnerability from my parents. They did a very good job instilling biblical truth in us, of training us to understand God, to have a healthy worldview. They did a really, really good job in a lot of those things. But there wasn't almost ever. I try to not use the words always and never, but there was almost never a time where either my mom or my dad would share a story from their own past of where they struggled with sin or where they struggled with shame, or just a hard life lesson. And even as a kid, I remember, especially as a young teenager, which is like, asking, like, I wanted to know more, not because of like excitement, or just like, I want to get to know my parents' past a little bit. And that was definitely something that I saw, I recognized a bit, as much as I took for granted so much as a child, for sure. Like I really had a great childhood, but that was a piece that I recognized as a kid that was missing. And then I've really recognized now, not in judgment of my parents, not like angry or resentful, but just seeing like, okay, there was a puzzle piece missing.
So talk to me, tie the thread between the two for me. What do you like? Because as we're kind of laying the foundation to have this conversation of how do we raise children who have a healthy relationship to sex, what do you feel like either the invitation into vulnerability with your parents would have given you, or the lack of it left you in need of? And again, not to cast blame, like totally recognizing and agreeing with that.
Right. Because obviously I have no clue how, if my parents had opened up, and I don't know that I would have done anything differently. Right. Definitely recognizing, especially like, let's say my dad, I still don't know, like I've learned some things, but I still don't know like what his childhood was or just his life was in terms of sexuality. And yet, if there had been some openness there, it would have helped me to see that I'm not unique in some of my struggles.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah.
Cause like, okay, so I went on like this little rant last time, and I'm going to try not to do that again here, but
do the rants. My people are used to rants. Go.
When I think about, and this is my experience, so again, I realize this is not everything, but growing up in the church, this was my experience of sexual sin, especially in marriage, especially adultery. It's like every so often. I mean, I don't know. I don't remember if it happened like 3 times or 7 times. A handful of times, because we grew up in the same church. I went to the same church for the first 20 plus years of my life. A handful of times, there would be a couple or a spouse, depending on what exactly happened, that would like, there'd be an announcement like, hey, there's been infidelity. There's been, and then sometimes the family would disappear. We'd never see him again. Sometimes, oftentimes, there'd be a divorce, or at least a separation. We'd see one spouse. We'd never see the other one again. Yeah. And then a couple times, the family would return to church. And I don't know what I was expecting or what I would have wanted to see, but it was just like, it was like a death.
Yeah.
And just like you started off this conversation, unfortunately, what I don't have is like tons of solutions here.
Right.
But just like looking back on it and going, okay, so if I cross this line, like it's death. There's no going back.
Yes. Oh, yes. Okay.
And on one hand, like, yeah, I need to have a healthy, recognition of the destruction of sin. But I truly had no idea that there could be healing. I had no idea that, and even zooming out from marriage, like as a Christian, my relationship with Christ, I had no conception of, at least on a practical level. Like I knew scripture, but I had no practical conception of what redemption could look like on earth. And
Mhm.
I'm not, who knows what my parents could have told me. Like they couldn't have given me that, right? But just to have conversations around this.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, okay, so you're blowing my mind right now because here's what I thought we were going to be talking about, and I think we'll probably still touch on this. Is this idea of like, when do you introduce the idea of sex and how much do you share and all that stuff? But here's what I'm hearing, and I think it's so true. And this is one of the things that was kind of mulling in my brain, but now you're bringing it to the forefront. Ultimately, what you shared in our prior conversation was you talked a lot about insecurity being kind of in very much at the forefront as you were a teenager starting to step into these addictive patterns, these addictive loops. And then now you're talking about intimacy and a window into your parents' lives as adults, and this idea of what does um, what does it truly look like to be redeemed by God? What does it
Right.
look like to know first through narrative with your parents, with the church, then through your own experience, maybe shepherded through with parents? What does it look like to know there is nowhere you can go that is beyond the reach of the redeeming and resurrection God?
Yeah.
And so, really, what I wonder is, are we missing the mark a bit as parents when the focus is more on checking a box and going, talk to the kids about sex? They understand the birds and the bees. They know about what's going to happen to their bodies during puberty. Boom, 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 boom. And if we don't instead cultivate a lifestyle of there is nowhere you can be that is outside the reach of the grace of God, then all we've got is a check box. Is that kind of what you're telling me?
Yes. And two words stand out to me there that I love, and cultivate and lifestyle. Because something that I like, I guess I'll say preach, because I can get preachy with it, is, I mean, the word infrastructure, like that's filled with my Instagram posts and podcast interviews, because infrastructure, everyone has an infrastructure. Now I can either
Mm.
build one intentionally, or I can get what life gives me, but I'm going
Ooh,
to have an infrastructure. And so, like,
yes.
my decision making processes and how I interact with people, how I interact with God, whether I do or I don't, right? How I interact with myself, how I interact with healthy living habits, all of that is my infrastructure. My boundaries or lack thereof, all of that is infrastructure. And as parents, I have an infrastructure, but whether I intentionally choose to build one or not is up to me, right? And so, I mean, Carrie and I are, yeah, certainly not, as I know we're belaboring the point, but like, we're not going to pretend that we're experts on anything, but we do intentionally build an infrastructure where we can talk about anything,
Yes.
and our
Oh,
kids can
yes.
ask anything.
Yes.
Our boys, now they're all different ages. I mean, barely, right?
Yeah,
But
I know. I can't get over it.
like, especially our middle two, they would always get asked, are there twins? And yeah, it's
Wow.
like, no twins, but almost. Um, so they're all different ages, and they've all got different personalities and different
Mhm.
ways of thinking, but all four of them know our story.
Yeah.
Now, our 12-year-old Elijah, he basically knows the full story. I mean, like, he could listen to the earlier podcast and nothing would surprise him.
Yeah.
Our youngest, Isaiah, he's 8. Um, I've shared stuff with him, with his brothers. We've talked about stuff. I don't know how much he's absorbed, or, he's like playing with Hot Wheels as we're talking,
Yes.
but like, they know that dad hurt their mom. They know that dad struggled and was trapped in sexual sin. They know that dad felt like there was no way out. They know that dad felt like there was no way to have a relationship with God. And they know that God has healed that. And they know, I mean, every Monday night we go to recovery, and they call it night church, but they know it's recovery.
Oh
And
my
and so,
gosh.
like, the stigma of recovery that is oftentimes there, that recovery is for, kind of yucky people on the outside, or people that have these problems. And people,
Mhm.
it's like, no, recovery is for anyone that is hurting, that needs healing.
Yes.
Carrie, I mean, this is a side thing, but like, Carrie and I say all the time, like, we wish everyone would join a recovery program, because recovery, ultimately what it does is it strips away that exoskeleton I talked about in the earlier episode, right? It strips away the
Yes.
exoskeleton of, I'm going to do things my way, you know, whether I knew the exoskeleton that I was building or not. I'm going to do things my way. I'm going to figure things out my way.
Yes.
And it strips all that away. It strips out so much ego. It strips away so much selfishness. And it rebuilds in me a healthy way of interacting with life. That's what recovery does.
Yes. No,
So
that's so good. I love it. And you know, you'd said in the prior episode, almost like, I'm glad mine was bad enough that I got the help.
yeah,
And I thought about saying the same at the time and just didn't, but I can't help saying it now. Like, yes, so mine just briefly was, I was headed towards suicide. And so it was like, I either die or get help. And if it hadn't been that bad, you know, I have
yes,
a lot of people in my life who just, they're the walking wounded because they're okay. You know,
right,
they look pretty good. And there was no looking good for me. You know, it
right,
was like, and so there's something so beautiful about that. And to cultivate that conversation in the home when the sins and the struggles are coveting our brother's toys, or, you know, being angry that a friend called us a name, when the challenge when the appearance is relatively small, but those are still deep heart issues of,
yeah,
like, you know, wanting what's not yours, you know, wanting to control the actions of another, caring
right,
more about what someone else says about you than what God says about you. Like, it's all right there happening in our own backyard on the playground.
yep.
Mm, so good.
So yeah, just having these conversations, allowing for conversations,
Yes.
be sometimes I do a better job at this than others, but you know, being okay saying I don't know, right?
Yeah.
Um, and you talk about, I mean, so going to the, you know, the topic that we thought we were going to focus on, right?
I know.
Like the idea of talking to our kids about sex. Um, maybe this will be blatantly obvious, but something that we've definitely had to learn, and we constantly are like reminding ourselves and each other is, so I had a buddy at the gym. He's like, hey, he's like, Logan, have you given your son the talk? Like, because my oldest boy comes to the gym with me sometimes, and so he knows him a little bit. And I was like, well, we don't we didn't give him the talk. Like we talk about it. You know, we talk about sex.
Yeah.
And I didn't say it from like, that wasn't a place of like hubris. It was just like, that was a light bulb moment for me at one point. Is it's not about the talk. It's about conversations, and that conversation is going to evolve. That conversation is going to look a little bit different with each kid, but talking about life. And yeah, as things change, and as a child gets older, as they have different experiences, that's going to include different things. But yeah, it wasn't, we didn't do something where we sat down with a couple books and said, okay, we've never talked about this thing before, but now we're going to talk for the next 45 minutes about this thing, and let's not talk about it again.
Yes. Yes.
And okay, and I don't want to forget, so I'm just going to throw it out there as part of an hopefully ongoing conversation. For it, maybe you've already been introduced to these, I don't know, but good pictures, bad pictures.
I got the books from the library after hearing you and Tanya Joya talking about them.
Okay,
And so, yeah, I've read through the first one. I haven't read through I've
which
read
one
through
did you
the
start with?
junior. I read junior
You read the
first.
junior, yeah.
Yes. And I've got both of them. So I still need
Okay.
to read the other one.
So those books, yeah, I love those books because they are Christ-centered,
Yes.
they're faith-based, they dive super deep into science. Even the junior, if I remember correctly, I mean, it talks about addiction. It talks about, um, I mean, it's not like cartoonish at all. It's just, you know, it's a little bit more digestible, right, for a younger kid.
Yes.
But it talks about how I am changing my brain pathways and
Yes.
how it's getting corrupted if I'm looking at bad pictures, right?
Yes.
Um, and then
Which, just to flag it for our people, like, those are two books written for children, one for like 8 and under, and then one for older, that are specifically talking about pornography in a way
yeah,
that is meant to introduce or facilitate the conversation among parents and children. Sorry, go ahead.
and the no, you're good. And I mean, the junior, in my opinion, I mean, obviously, I'm not here to tell anyone how to parent, but in my opinion, I mean, if your kid is old enough to talk about just about anything, they're old enough to talk through the junior version.
Yes.
They might not understand some of it. You might need to revisit it, a few more times as they get older, but you can go through it. Similar to what we talked about in the last conversation that you and I had, like, it doesn't get graphic, but you got to be ready to have some conversations, right? Yes. You got to be ready to be real, be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And then the older one, it goes even deeper on some of the science. It goes even deeper on what's happening to my brain when I am an addict, what's happening when I am retraining my brain in these corrupted, depraved, sinful ways. Of course, whether it's pornography or other destructive habits. But I love that marriage. As an aside, I should have said this in our previous podcast that we did, as a resource for anyone that wants to understand sexual addiction and recovery just on a really deep level. The Conquer series, I have it on DVD. I have the box set because I'm a boomer, and then you can watch it digitally. But it's several hours. But it's the single best resource if you just want to be educated. If you just want to sit back and be educated, it's an incredible resource, and it's Christ-centered, it's science-centered, and it is very practical. It's a marriage of three things that oftentimes get separated when people think about addiction. It's like you either need to follow God and trust him, or you don't need God, you don't need Christ, you need science. Or it's like, dude, none of that stuff matters. You just need to work on what's practical in front of you. And we need to do all three things because God created the universe, so he's kind of in charge of how science works. And right. I need to focus on practical, tangible behaviors, right? So the Conquer series does an incredible job of going into this. As soon as I read those books, my first thought, and I said this to Carrie, is like, dude, this is like the Conquer series, but very much distilled and boiled down into book format for kids. Mm-hmm. It's so cool. So those books, I cannot emphasize enough how incredible of a resource those books are. Truthfully, like if somebody doesn't have kids, like they wouldn't be a terrible way to just understand some of this stuff in like pamphlet format.
Yeah.
But
it was, well, and that's why I hadn't finished or hadn't gotten through the non-junior one, because I was like, this is so dense. I don't want to just like cram this in my brain like right before I go to bed. Yeah. It really did. It went through everything, but like really readable. It was awesome. So talk to me about this part though. And you and I were talking offline a little bit, how I had a lot more conversations with my children about sex, about development and things like that when we were in the process of having our babies, because it was just like right there. And so there was this natural question, curiosity. I'm noticing, especially as my older kids are getting older, that there's a little bit more, and some of it's temperament, there's a little bit more reticence to kind of like bring up questions and curiosities. The little ones are still like, why does her body look different from his body? And, there's a little bit more of that coming up. So what does it look like for you and Carrie to kind of create opportunities for these conversations? Because I think in my mind of the one time there was the talk, right? I think a lot of kids remember that one moment where they got sat down. It was really
I had to
awkward.
ask my parents to give me the talk. How's that for awkward?
Yeah.
I literally asked my brother, I was like, dude, can you tell me how this works? And he was like, you should ask mom and dad. Or whatever.
Yeah, I got to sit down from one parent, and then the other parent, like way too late, was like, hey, you know about that stuff, right? And you're not doing it. And I was like, we're way, like, it's so whatever would have been, had already been decided at that point. Yep. So talk to me about creating opportunities, because that's where I feel like I'm really falling short right now. I could field all the questions. We talk about everything, but now I'm like, I need this to happen. And I don't know whether to say, hey, like, I want to talk to you about something, or like, do you pray for opportunities? What does that look like?
Something that it's so hard for me to push past the voices that are like, dude, that worked for you one time, but maybe that won't always work, or that worked for you guys, but I'm going to push past it. I'm just going to share it.
Go share it.
So
yeah.
This is something that has been successful on a repeated basis, for whatever that's worth, for me and Carrie.
Yes.
I emphasized a fair bit in our previous conversation, I statements, and how much I focus on them. And that comes specifically from recovery. because at prodigals, I have to talk in I statements.
Mhm.
I have to own my stuff. What that does as a total side thing is, and I promise I'm going somewhere with this, when I
I'm here for
speak in
it.
I statements, a guy on the other side of the table, if we're in a group of like 8 guys discussing a lesson, we're not allowed to say, well, we as guys, or the church, or, well, you know how you do this, or my brother-in-law. It's like, no, I've talked about my experience, my stuff.
Yes.
And something that I realized as I got into recovery, honestly, probably several years in, it wasn't a quick thing, was realizing it also helps me to listen when somebody else talks in I statements. It helps me to own what they're saying. What it does is it allows me to hear what they're saying, try it on, think about it, consider it, and think about it through my eyes. Cause we're inherently selfish people, right? Like that's what I am as a human. And so it just from a psychological level, it's really helpful for me listening, let alone me talking.
Yes.
I
It creates a
bring
little safety too, where you're not feeling talked at or condemned
correct.
or anything. Oh, so good. Okay. Yeah.
Right. And so the reason I bring that up is because the best opportunity, the best way to have these opportunities that Carrie and I have found so far, not experts, is when we are just talking about stuff from our points of view, not saying like, hey guys, so no, there are times where like, hey, so that commercial came up and we try to like talk about that commercial, or hey, like this thing, like let's talk about this. We absolutely do that, but we try to not like pin them in the corner and be like, hey, this thing happened, we need to talk about it.
Yes.
If we are talking about ourselves, and this might sound kind of crazy, Carrie and I talk about our sexuality with the kids. What I mean by that is like, if we are smooching and like a kid, which, I mean, just in case it's not very obvious, I'm a big fan of like, I hope I want everyone to hear this. Like, if you're in a healthy relationship, like you should be smooching in front of your kids, like please.
Yes.
And so like our kids have asked like, so did you guys kiss before you were married? And I mean, okay, so getting real heavy real quick, my oldest son, I mean, he has asked questions like, he literally has asked me, he's like, so dad, did you do that with other women? That's what you were doing? And like that's a tough thing to have opened up, but I'm so thankful that he's free to ask that question.
Yes.
He has asked, if he asks, so did you guys kiss before you were married? You know, it, and talking about kissing, like, is kissing wrong? Just freeing them up to ask those questions, and certainly not shaming them, certainly not making them feel weird or bad, but kind of encouraging that, like, yeah, let's talk about it, because I want you guys to, yeah, not that we're the experts, but like, let's talk about reality, let's talk about where we've been, let's talk about what we've learned. I hope that can make sense, but just talking about things from our perspective instead of trying to preach at them from like this random third party angle.
Oh, it's so good. And I love too, like you've opened up something for me. We our family likes to watch Survivor, and we like to watch well, some of us, not me, like to watch sports. And so we're running into a lot of secular commercials as a result of that. And so we have a narrative around like, okay, we're all going to look away.
Right.
We're fast forwarding, whether it's violence or it's like romantic moments. And but that's such a great opportunity to talk about, why do we look away?
Right.
It's not shameful in and of itself. It's private, right?
Right.
And here's what God has offered to us, and here's why this is gift and why the other is distortion. And so I feel like I'm just sitting here ticking through all these opportunities where all I need to do actually is just lean in a little bit more than I am, or like when my husband and I are kissing, because like I am so pro smooching as well. I think it's very important, right? And yet, my kids will be like, oh, like my oldest is old enough to think that we're gross now, which is
Right,
fun.
right.
But to talk to her about like, hey, here's why that's an important part of our relationship. Um, and I just like, even just conversations around, sometimes there's a locked door, right? And like,
Right.
why is that okay and important without
Yep.
being detailed or, overly explicit with the kids? But I love what you're saying of just like, there are so many opportunities. So what I really need to do is turn my eyes on a little bit more and just look at what's already happening, because the unfortunate thing is, every single one of my kids has seen a commercial I wish they hadn't seen,
Right.
just on
Right.
mainstream television.
Yeah.
As a homeschooling entrepreneur mama, you are uniquely positioned to impact the kingdom of God both deep and wide. Isn't it time you partnered with a coach to help you close the gap between where you are and where you feel God calling you to go? As a veteran homeschool mama and seasoned entrepreneur and investor myself, I understand the unique challenges you face. And as a life coach, former lawyer, and woman of faith, I offer a unique combination of strategy, mindset, and spirit-led discernment to help you identify your next steps. Click the link in the show notes now to schedule a free exploratory call. I would love to partner with you in taking your business and homeschool journey to the next level.
Beyond just not being experts, I mean, here's something that I'm just
hold
going
on,
to be super.
Logan. So you're not an expert. I want to make sure, because I haven't
I
heard
know
that
I
yet.
lied to get on the show. I wanted to get that big guest fee,
That's right. That's right. The check's
So
in the mail.
beyond that, I mean, this is something that I'm just going to be extremely honest about. Carrie and I, and we've gone through a lot, and we've come together on so many things. We don't oftentimes we don't necessarily agree on the right angle on something, especially like when it comes to something on TV. I lean towards, let's err on the side of safety. Let's err on the side of just not putting that in front of my eyes, especially for myself, but also as a dad for them.
Yeah.
And I would say she leans, if it's ever a, kind of split the difference thing, she leans more towards like, perfect example would be like beach volleyball for the Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she's not a big fan of like, well, no, like we can't let the boys watch that because there's a lot of skin there. Like there's nothing inherently sexual about it. And it's like, we don't always agree.
Yeah.
And I have to, it's something that's hard for me that I've had to do a lot of work on. And thankfully there has been a lot of progressive victories. Like, it's okay. We don't have to always agree.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have some of those conversations in front of the kids, sometimes not.
Yeah.
I will say this, we almost never never try to avoid having a conversation in front of the kids.
Yeah.
And that is something that, like, at no point did we like sit down and write out a charter for our family. And like, that was rule number one. But it is something that Carrie and I have both been very intentional about, just given recovery and given rawness, is
Yes.
we are very hesitant to talk in private. There are times when we do, but we're extremely hesitant. Like, that needs to, we both would say that needs to be kind of a last ditch thing. Not necessarily that we're going to go grab the kids for every conversation, but if they're there and we're just in the living room and something comes up, like, we generally are just going to have the conversation and let them hear it. They may not, they're not necessarily an active part of it, but maybe they want to ask a question, right? Maybe they want to ask a question later. Maybe they want to say something about it. And like, we want them to have that opportunity, because what we talk about is real life. So why would we not want to invite them into real life?
Oh, I love that so much. One of the things that it left a mark on my life as a child was my parents never fought, and then they divorced. And so there was this mystery around.
Yeah.
And then I had a friend whose parents fought in front of her. And so I remember sitting there and they were telling me they were getting a divorce and going, why them? Like, my other friend, my friend fought all the time. And so I thought that arguing was bad. And so that's one of the things that we've actually decided to do as well, with one of those things of like, I don't know how this is going to turn out because it's kind of a grand experiment.
Right.
But one of our family non-negotiables is no hypocrisy.
Yep.
No hypocrisy. We're not
Yep.
going to whitewash it. We're not going to pretend everything's fine. We're not going to say, do as I say, not as I do, because of my own healing journey and my own recovery. And so we've had a lot of what I call fun marriage moments. We've worked through the things live in front of our children. And I'll point back to that with my children often and say, how daddy and I, will sometimes have something that we're working through. And sometimes it's even really hard and there's emotion there. And then you watch us get to the other side and you
Yep.
see the embrace and you see the reconciliation and the meeting of the minds and the understanding, right? Like
that word you just used is a word that pretty early in life, I remember thinking, okay, that I don't see that.
mm-hmm.
I basically never saw reconciliation with my parents.
Same. Yes. Yes.
I saw probably some version of forgive and forget, right?
Yes.
But I did not see reconciliation. So here, just so I don't forget, I'm just going to throw this out there. I do want to talk about anger, and I want to talk about. I mean, that doesn't technically fit into what we're supposed to be talking about, but as we're thinking through this, I mean, you talk about genuine, you talk about not being a hypocrite, like, because anger has been a huge part of my journey, just as a man, as a husband, as a dad. So I want to talk about that, but I'll use I statements. I'm not going to be preachy here. I apologize to my kids. Probably not daily, but I mean, multiple times a week. And I don't ever want to stop doing that, because here's the thing. I am imperfect in front of them every day.
Yes.
Is imperfect another word for sin? Yes. So then why would I not be apologizing for being a bad example in that moment? And I got to be careful that I'm not, coming to them like wallowing, right? Like, oh, I'm so sorry. I was such a bad dad. And I, to be honest, I used to have a pretty unhealthy, I mean, I was learning how to be a healthy person at all, but like early in recovery, I would kind of go too far where I'm like, almost like asking them to please love me again. Like
yes.
And so I, there's been some work there, but just especially if I am ever, I mean, I hold myself to this standard 100%. If I'm ever short with Carrie, if I'm ever rude to Carrie, if I ever sin against Carrie, just period, then I will apologize to every child that was in that room or within earshot.
Yes.
Because I can't control how they're going to grow up. I can't control like what they're going to be as adults, right? I can't control a lot of that, but I can definitely control if they have been given a daily example of the fact that their dad is fallen, but their dad apologizes, their dad seeks reconciliation, and their dad and their mom own their stuff and they're real about it. Like where they take that is up to them, but I got to make sure that they're at least given that example.
Okay. And I'm just so grateful to the Lord, y'all who are listening to this. Like, we prayed over this conversation. I've been in prayer over this conversation, and I didn't know where we were going, but I'm going to just tell you, Logan, one of the things I have as almost like a little, whenever I start to read statistics on pornography and sex outside of marriage and promiscuity and then read, looking at all this stuff from a parent perspective, I feel fear because I'm like, I don't want that for my children. And I don't know how to do enough to keep it from happening, to keep them from making those choices. But then what I'm reminded of in this conversation and what I've been reminded of in other times is it's always the same work, right? It's seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then we do that in front of our children. So what you're saying to me, what I keep hearing coming up is this idea of we are real in front of our children and we give them permission to be real. And because of what you described in the first episode of this idea of throughout even the early days of the addiction that you were experiencing, it wasn't like all fun and happy sunshine and rainbows. There was guilt and there was shame. And so what you're what you're telling me that's giving me so much hope and encouragement, I hope for those of you who are listening, you're feeling the same, is that actually when we teach our children what to do with guilt and shame, right? Like confession, asking for help, repentance, going before the Father who heals all things, that then we've actually put in place the dismantling tools to keep the addiction, or potentially, I mean, our children are going to make their choices, right?
Right.
But we've given them the tools to um, to kind of break down the addiction before it starts to own them at a level where it's really hard to break free, because they
Right.
already have a context and a language to go, oh, I feel guilt, oh, I feel shame, oh, I something happened that was bad, and I already know mom and dad are safe to go to. I already know there's not some kind of perfection that they've reached that I just have realized I've now fallen short of. So I mean, like, what do you think? Do you think, like, is that where we start and then we just build from there?
Yeah, having that at the heart of it, having that intentionality, focusing on what I can control. Like, I mean, that's another common thread throughout
Yes.
this, right? From recovery is what can I control? I can control what I do, what I put in. I can't control the outcome. When I think about it with my kids, I cannot control, as you said, whether they get themselves trapped in a sin cycle, trapped in addiction, make terrible
Yes.
choices. Like I can't control any of that. What I can control is making sure that I don't want them to get trapped in a cave of addiction or any sin cycle. They might get trapped. But what I can control is making sure that when they have left the house, or even while they live in this house, that they've got a map of how to get out. And
Yes.
that's something that God has given me, right? That God has given us as a family. And it's, of course, it looks a little bit different for every person, right? But like there is a way out of that cave, no matter what cave you're in. Because again, not blame shifting, but when I was in that spot in my 20s, I didn't think there was a way out of that cave.
Yes. Yes. That's so true. And that's really, grace is the only thing that offers us that. And it's a paradigm that you don't have to give if you have not received it. Right. So like, cause I remember that too. I remember when my husband and I got married, I had a breakdown within the first month because we'd had our first couple of fights. And I had a vision about like what marriage was going to look like. And of course it didn't look like that, because my image was from television. When you're married, you spoon when you sleep. And my husband's like, my arm is going to fall off. If I can pop
Right.
off my arm and put it by the bedside table, fine. But so I was like, we're not going to make it, because my parents were in separate bedrooms. And so like, we're not going to make it if we don't look like what my picture of love looks like, which, 14 years in, I look back and I think of that immature view of love and have a lot of compassion on how little I knew of it, right? Even
Right.
even in my mid-20s, because I didn't grow up in that love. Um, but I remember realizing I thought of love as, you get married and there's a pie. There's this perfect pie, and then every fight is a bite off the pie. And the goal, this is so terrible. This is all I got. All right, y'all know I'm a mess. My goal was for us to die before the pie was gone. And I didn't know love expands, when you've really got that narrative of grace and forgiveness, of being known and knowing the other, that there's actually, I mean, my love for my husband is so eclipses now what I had for him at the beginning of our marriage, because I know him more. And
Yeah.
so I think what you're talking about is so beautiful, of like, let's provide this narrative of grace and forgiveness and love, and let it be the home that our children grow up in.
Yeah.
Because like the thing that's catching me, like when I think about promiscuity, when I think about sex outside of marriage, it's like that verse where Paul says, like, it's wrong to join with a prostitute because then you've become one, in perversion, essentially.
Right. Right.
And I feel like one of the things that we've missed, that I think it's a fight the church has kind of stopped fighting, is this idea of like, okay, don't have sex before marriage. That's like the, that's the gold star. But if you're
Right.
going to have sex outside of marriage, just make sure that you ended up marrying the guy that you had sex with. And
Right.
somehow that kind of whitewashes it all and it's all okay now, right?
Right.
But what God says is no, like let there be no physical union until there has been a spiritual union. And if we raise our children understanding their value in Christ, then it no longer becomes a question of how much can I get away with and still be
Right.
okay.
Right.
It now becomes how can I honor myself and the people around me. And that conversation, although it is intimately connected with a conversation of sex and sexuality, it's also intimately connected with every other aspect of our lives as believers.
Yeah.
Hmm.
When I think about, teaching them specifically about purity and sex outside of marriage, whether that's before you marry that person, or dating around and having sex with different people, whatever that looks like, there's times where I have this kind of like fatalistic viewpoint of like, well, they're gonna do what they're gonna do, and I can't control that, which is like, those are true statements. So like, what's the point of trying to teach them? All I can do is make sure that there's an open conversation. And I think there's truth in those words, but that's also that's a bare minimum way to look at it. I think, there's, to not try to educate them at all, to not try to teach them at all, right? It's a cop out. It would be a cop out, selfish way for me to approach it. But I certainly don't know the exact way, right, with each kid. And I don't want them to, I'm not going to try to approach it the exact same. But the idea of every kid, as they get older, and whether they're still living in the house or not, it is never, as long as they are living, it is not too late to seek Christ, to seek healing. I want that to be instilled in them. And coupled with an understanding of the consequences, right? The consequences of sin, the spiritual consequences, the physical consequences. And you hit on, my value in Christ, which of course then implies everyone else's value, right?
Yes.
That it's, I mean, because that's been a huge part of my recovery, not necessarily recovery in the sense of like my program, but just something that recovery has given me, my part of my own healing as a man, coming from bondage and sexual addiction to now say that I'm no longer in bondage, is recognizing a triggering woman is not the enemy to be avoided.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like, this is, like the Proverbs 7 woman is like, it's in scripture, like obviously, like there's a reason why that's in there. And yet it's so easy. And I do think it's very common in the church. So this idea that like, okay, like if a woman is tempting like that, that's the enemy. You stay clear of her. You stay clear of those things. And that's not the enemy. And I want my boys to understand that's not the enemy.
Yeah.
Lust is the enemy. Satan's the enemy.
Yes.
I need to learn how to love humans, no
Mm-hmm.
matter what they are, or like, no matter what sex they are, no matter if it's somebody in front of me or online, whatever, to have a loving spirit. And there are times where I need to choose safety as the number one priority, and I need to stop watching something, or I need to no longer interact with somebody. Like, there's times where I need to do that. But I also need to learn how to love people and to treat them with respect and dignity. And I'm not going to go the next 7-8 decades of my life just pretending women don't exist because they might be a trigger to me.
When we're in that of like, this person's triggering, and for me, there are emotional kind of interactions that will trigger me, right? And so then I'm in fear, right? And so it might be that I need to create space, because I just know like this is a match that's just a little bit too hot. I need to take a step back from it. But then there's also the side of like, to what degree can I walk in compassion and just say, I see a human being who's on their own journey, and I recognize the emptiness that might lead to whatever the behavior is, that's so
And
good.
the more I am seeking Christ, the more I'm getting healthier, the more I am seeking healthy infrastructure, generally speaking, the more and more I'm going to be able to interact with people on a more holistic level.
Yes.
And I'm going to be able to be more and more vulnerable with those people. Like,
Mhm.
and to give an example, like if all of this sounds kind of like in the stars and nebulous, like what that's looked like for me, I'll just give this example. Again, we're supposed to be talking about parenting, and I'm sorry, but
We'll get there.
um,
This is part of it.
so this was like 3 years ago, I think. So like 5 years of sobriety and relatively healthy living. And I was at the post office, and there was a lady nearby, and I had seen her. She walked in front of me, and my general practice is, woman walks in front of me, is I'm going to bounce my eyes. I don't need to be looking at her. I don't evaluate to see if she's a trigger or if she's attractive. And then it's like, I don't need to be looking at her. Just general practice. Especially if it's like, okay, like this woman is, there is a trigger there. Like there is a visual temptation. Like I'm definitely going to, maybe I'm going to adjust my stance a little bit. Like, I think that's general safety, makes sense. And I remember I did that. Like, okay, it seemed like she's an attractive woman. She doesn't need to be, I don't need to put her in my eyesight. And I'm going about my business. And she had like this giant box, and she was trying to carry it. And I remember like pretty quickly things started to click in my head of like, okay, she has this giant box. And I'm sorry, like, hopefully this doesn't sound chauvinistic. Like, she was a tiny little lady. And this is a huge box. For anybody, this would be a really big box. And I remember thinking like, okay, she cannot pick this thing up. I don't know where her car's at. I don't know how she's gonna be able to carry it. Hopefully somebody can like please help her. Like, she needs a little bit of help. And I'm just like standing there, and I'm like, okay, but like if I were to offer to help, number one, like, is that gonna come off as flirtatious? Because in my addiction, that would have been the easiest MO in the world, right? To be like, oh, let me help you, blah blah blah. Let me be this nice white knight, right? And I'm like hoping that somebody can help her. Nobody's helping her. And then I'm like, okay, I think I'm going to help her. Well, what are my motivations? Am I helping her? I'm not doing it for sexual reasons, but am I doing it to feel good? Right? Am I doing it to get a compliment? Am I doing it to feel like I'm this little savior in this tiny little moment? And I'm like checking my motivations. And like, no, I want to help her because she needs help. And this is hard for her, I think. And so I can offer to help. And I did that. And I'm sorry, this is like a super bloated story, but that moment, I think back on that because that was a really, really huge moment in a way, because there was a time in my recovery where my primary thing that I needed to focus on was purely safety above
Yes.
all else.
Mhm.
I basically did need to avoid contact with women who were not trusted inner circle, like my wife, my mom. I mean, there were very few women that I should be interacting with.
Yes.
And there's still some of that that's going to stay. Like, as a general practice, I don't start up conversations with a woman at a grocery store. That's just a general practice.
Yeah.
And if I do, actually, I put it out there. Like I put a text out there to recover. Like, oh, I said this to the cashier. Not because it's evil, right? But as time has gone on, like, it allows me to, even in a tiny little moment like that, it allows me to show love to people. Yeah. And early in recovery, the best way for me to love that person would have been probably to keep her safe from me, right?
Yeah.
Because I was a predator trying to heal. And as time goes on, I can be a little bit more holistically loving to other human beings, female or not.
Yes.
And I don't know where that's connected to parenting, but like I want my boys to understand that, again, women are not the enemy when it comes to lust. Women are not the enemy when it comes to sexual sin. It is Satan, and it is Satan's perversion of the world.
Yes, that's so good. And what I hear you saying is, like, as we heal or as we grow in Christ, when there's not something to heal from for our kids, for example, then we're better able to navigate the complexities, because whether it's, like going to the pool and sorry. Okay, whether it's going to the pool and there are girls in two pieces and that's a trigger for my boys, or there are like whatever it might be, that we don't need to fight against the other person. Oh, they shouldn't be dressing like that. Oh, they shouldn't be acting like
Right.
that we can grow, we can teach our children to grow in strength. And I think, because one of the things that I keep puzzling over, and this is I think this is the last like piece I want to dig into with you, is like, it's so tempting for me as a mom to be like, here are your do's and here are your don'ts, and
Yep.
then like, go forth, and just this idea of like, that's not like, I want them to have clarity in their minds around what does God invite us to? What is the ideal standard that we're shooting for? The ideal standard of a pursuit of purity. Like, I'm reading through Sex, Jesus, and the Conversation That the Church Forgot with Mo Isom as the author. I don't know if you run into that, but she talks about, we start with a list in our minds of like, the ideal is virginity at marriage. And then it's like, as long as we can keep the label virgin in marriage,
Yeah.
like, we get the gold star, right? And she's like, we've completely missed the mark. The ideal standard is comprehensive throughout our whole life, which is purity before Christ. How much like him can we seek to look for all of our days, which requires us to know our role and the role of others as his beloved. And when we know that, then it puts us in that place of love that you're talking about, of like, we must protect what he has given us, and we must be protective of what he has given to others, which means union with another sexually should be reserved for covenant marriage, because that's where favor lies. That's where the Lord says, be fruitful and multiply. Like, that this is the place to enjoy that relationship. And outside of it, you're actually stealing from another, and potentially like more than another, because of that union and everything that's to come.
Right.
So how do you think we walk out? Like, what does it look like, practically speaking, when you're in conversations with your boys, to bring it back to parenting? We made it back to parenting. This conversation of like, okay, there's a standard that is beyond what we can ever reach, that is before us all of our lives. And here's how it plays out in the realm of our sexuality.
So my approach to that stems from this principle that I believe very deeply, that I do use as a filter, imperfectly, but I use as a filter for my own decision making, just in life, outside of parenting, outside of sex. And we have a ton of conversations. I have a ton of conversations with my boys along these lines. I believe that one of, if not the most important thing I can do as I just go through my life, as I go through my day, is to love others, is to highly value the sanctity of every single life I come across, however that looks, right? And so whether it is, going outside, like, we have a parking garage at the bottom of my office where I work, and there's always a congregation of homeless people down there. And so interacting with them as I would if it was a colleague walking into the building, giving them a head nod, saying hi, not trying to just ignore with my head down, because, and I'm not saying I do that perfectly, but I do intentionally practice that, because in my opinion, that's how I can value the sanctity of their life as a human, right? As an image of God standing there. So by that same measure, as the kids are on the playground, like, are you showing love to the other creations of God, right?
Yes.
That are on that playground. And I'm not saying I always use that verbiage, right? But it for me, it goes back to that. And I do what I can to try to instill that in them, is you're not being nice to Susie because God says, to, like, you're not being nice to Susie just because God doesn't want you to hit Susie. You're being nice to Susie because you want to show love to somebody who's created in God's image, and you don't want to steal from your brother, not because God says don't steal, but because that would hurt your brother deeply, and your brother is created in God's image, and that is your flesh and blood, and that's your brother, and like all these things. I mean, basically all of my decisions can be traced back, for better, for worse, to, am I showing love to someone else? Or some cases, am I showing love to myself, right?
Yes.
There aren't many choices in life that can't be filtered through that lens.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so good. And what I love most, and y'all, I hope you guys hear this in this conversation, and I'm kind of like, my mind's blown a little bit. I feel like I just like need to take a breath after we're done talking, because I'm like, wow, there's not this prescription of just first you do this and then you do this and then you do this, then you do this. It's like, it's love, right? It comes back to love. It comes back to authenticity. It comes back to humility. It comes back to, choosing to lay down hypocrisy, choosing to give this authentic view of grace in life, and the messy, beautiful thing that it is. You have chosen, Logan, you and Carrie, to open a window into your lives that you could have chosen to keep shut, right? Like, your kids were young enough. There could have been this like, oh, like the oldest was 4 or 5, whatever. They don't need to know about that. And in love, you chose to be revelatory and say, but God did all of this. We are here because of his grace and kindness and mercy. And you bring your children into the fold of that, of that redemption story, and it becomes their own. Right. Yep. And then now there's this constant dialogue about, how do we expand what he started with us, all those years ago when the light first dawned, right? When he first broke through. Absolutely. So beautiful. I love it. Okay. I feel like we could just keep going, because like, how do you stop talking about the gospel? But I think we're going to leave it here for now. And maybe we'll have another one of these conversations, because this is, and we'll keep learning more. Next year, our kids will be 13. We'll know even more then. The experts can reconvene. But in the meantime, all right, you told us in the last episode, tell us again, how can my people connect with you?
Yeah. Instagram, my handle is no longer in bondage, and there's periods in between each word, no longer in bondage. And, feel free to shoot me a message. Please give me a follow. As I shared before, my content, it comes from a place of wanting to share sexual addiction recovery awareness and tools. So it's very practical stuff that can be bare minimum educational, if not applicable directly, but it's healthy living, it's not just like, oh, if you're an addict who can't stop cheating on your wife, this is for you. No, if you want to get healthier with habits, get healthier with how you interact with life, get healthier with how you do things on a daily basis by yourself, with your family, with others, then 99% of my content is going to be helpful. Not because I'm so smart, but because God has like surrounded me with so many people that have poured into me that I'm doing what I can to try to pass on.
I love it. Logan, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for all of your time.
I am extremely thankful and gracious for the opportunity. So thank you, Anna.
It's been great. Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of She Considers a Field. If you found value in this episode, I would be so grateful if you would leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and be sure to share with a friend who needs some encouragement on her journey today too. Until next time, remember, you've got this, because he's got you.